The name of our podcast, TechSequences, is really a mashup of two words, technology and consequences. We are fascinated by the consequences, intended or unintended, of the internet and related technologies for the way we live, play, and work. We are your hosts, Leslie Daigle and Alexa Raad. We started our careers at the dawn of the internet and have been friends, colleagues, and comrades in arms for the better part of 20 years. In this podcast, we examine the impact internet-related technologies have made or may make in our lives. I'm Alexa Raad.
And I'm Leslie Daigle.
Welcome to TechSequences. We've heard the relentless drumbeat of AI's downside, the erosion of critical thinking, the looming shadow of mass job replacement, and the creeping fear that we are collectively coding ourselves into obsolescence. The narrative is often binary. Either machines take over or we retreat into a Luddite defiance. But between these two extremes lies a critical yet often ignored question. Is there a bright side? More importantly, is there a practical roadmap for the professional who wants to use AI as a supplement to their unique human skills rather than a total replacement for them? The risk we face today is the sophisticated evolution of what happened with the introduction of the digital calculator. Decades ago, as basic arithmetic skills shifted because the calculator became a pocket-sized utility, we lost a certain mental muscle in lieu of the ability to perform higher-order mathematics. Today, we are at a more dangerous juncture. We are at risk of atrophying our foundational domain expertise and our very capability for critical thought. The greatest danger we face isn't AI becoming too smart. The danger is a psychological one, that we are beginning to treat this technology as an infallible oracle rather than a capable yet fallible intern. In an era where AI can scale content, code, and communication at hyperspeed, the baseline for production has dropped to zero. This creates a massive shift in the economy of human value. When the act of making becomes a commodity, your value as a professional shifts entirely. It moves away from the raw output and towards the two things a machine cannot authentically replicate: judgment and intent. We find ourselves standing at a strategic crossroads. For years, the promise of automation was about efficiency, doing the same things, just faster. But we are discovering a hard truth. The automation fallacy proves that automating a broken or outdated process only creates faster chaos. If we abdicate our role as a final arbiter of quality, we don't lose our jobs, we lose our professional soul. We become nodes in a system rather than architects of a vision. How do we actually bridge that gap? How do we move beyond the simple chat box interface and weave these capabilities into the very fabric of our creative flow without disrupting the deep work required for a breakthrough? We are entering an era of unprecedented individual leverage, where a single professional could theoretically command the impact and reach once reserved for entire organizations. Achieving that level of influence requires more than just new software. It demands a total redesign of how we work, think, and lead. How can we navigate this transition from replacement to augmentation?
Our guest today is Ted Yang. Ted is an MIT-trained engineer and a seasoned entrepreneur who has founded over 12 companies. He has also served as a finance executive at legendary firms like Bridgewater and Citadel. Beyond the boardroom, Ted is a global speaker and an Emmy-nominated author who serves on Connecticut's Board of Regents for Higher Education. His new book, Ageless Peak Performance, focuses on how AI can be thoughtfully adopted to expand human capability and opportunity. Welcome, Ted.
Hi, thank you, Leslie and Alex, for having me.
So, as Alexa noted in the intro, we often hear about AI as a threat to jobs and critical thinking. But from your perspective as an entrepreneur and an engineer, what's the bright side for professionals who feel overwhelmed by this technology?
Well, I think the bright side is pretty obvious, and it goes earlier to what you were saying, Alexa, about the electronic calculator. Humankind has been building tools for a very long time. Arguably, that's what separates us, from the primates, is our ability to create tools. More recently, and recently being hundreds of years, we've been creating intellectual tools, such as the printing press, or such as writing, or such as the calculator. And AI is the next evolution of that. And the bright side is that as an intellectual tool, you can use it to augment your abilities if you are careful, right? As with the calculator, how many of us can do basic arithmetic? But if we didn't learn how to do basic arithmetic and we simply just learned how to use a calculator, we would get a lot of erroneous results. You couldn't at a glance know that three-digit number times a three-digit number cannot possibly be a two-digit number, right? And now you're asking people to do the same thing with AI, they have to keep their judgment there. But if you can do that, if you can keep yourself centered while you're using AI to magnify your capabilities, that is the bright side. Avoiding replacement and instead focusing on empowerment.
So you suggest treating AI as an intern rather than an oracle. And so what does that mean in practice?
Sure. So those of us who've worked in corporate contexts or even people starting their careers who want an internship, I think understand that an intern is someone at the beginning of their career who is very bright, who is very eager, but unfortunately doesn't have the experience and really the domain knowledge to be that useful. And in many ways, your LLMs are the same thing. Well, first of all, they're programmed to act in this very obsequious fashion. That's actually changing now because people have rebelled against it. But if you looked at ChatGPT, Claude, or any of the others, the mainstream LLMs in the last few years, it's incredibly obsequious. It will do what you ask it to, even if it's wrong, and even if it's right. And that's very similar behavior to someone at the beginning of their career working to try to get a full-time job. It could be bright, but they are really second guessing themselves all the time. And that's really what you end up with when you have an intern. But instead, thanks to Google and thanks to the way in which we've been trained to use tools like the internet itself, we've been conditioned to get answers. And so a lot of people, when they say they use generative AI, they use ChatGPT, they're using it like Google, they're typing in a query and they're expecting the answer to just come back and say, well, you know what, that's pretty much what the answer is. But if you instead you treat this as an intern, if you treat it as someone that wants to please you, that is bright and is going to do their best, but may be wrong, and even worse, when they're wrong, not admit it, right? Then you start to put your head in the right space. It is not an oracle. It is something that has a lot of knowledge, maybe in many cases more knowledge than you, but you have to be very careful about whether it will be right or wrong because the default state will be to produce something that you like as opposed to being right.
When you said obsequious, I had to chuckle a little bit because that's exactly what I said to a friend of mine about. I was talking to an AI agent in my car, and the way that they were responding was so obsequious that it was definitely a standout. So when you're talking, is that what you mean when you say the value, the human value moves from production to judgment and intent? That just automating things, the AI gets you to produce perhaps better and faster, but it's still lacking the judgment and the intent, and that's what the human being brings. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think that is one of the key pieces of this. And in my book, I lay it out in 4 principles, and these are 2 of the major principles, right? And I think the key part of what makes humans capable is our ability to discern. Now, I should say it's not innate, we train it, but we train our ability to discern fact from fiction, good from bad, fake news from real. And this is the key skill, the absolute key skill that you need to have in this day and age because simple production has become so cheap. And the analogy I have here is it's very similar to what we've seen in blue collar manual labor, right? It used to be an incredible premium was made when you had to have artisans and the artisans protected by guilds that had to do basically anything you wanted. Basically anything you wanted to buy had to be made by someone who spent years, if not decades, perfecting their craft, making almost anything, like a barrel or a cup even, right? Not just complicated machinery, very basic things. And now, yeah, tools, exactly. And what happened was you saw in the Industrial Revolution, in automation, in all these different capabilities, we collectively broke apart the processes required. So that wasn't one person or a group of people who had this incredible expertise, but a lot of people who didn't have a lot of expertise that were able to produce. And now you brought down the production costs. You were able to scale the hell out of it. But what that did was that cheapened the value of the production itself, right? You broke the dam open, and now everyone could have a cup. Now, was it as good of a cup or as good of a table as a master could make? No, it wasn't. But more people could have those cups and not just the incredibly rich people, right? And now you're seeing that same thing happen thanks to AI. A lot of the thought work that we considered to be higher order, that you had to go through all this schooling, get a fancy degree, and do all this, interning and expertise training in order to get there, we're now discovering it's not that complicated. It's not that interesting to produce because AI can produce it in a fashion much faster than the best human could do. So now mere production of thought work, mere production of words, mere production of spreadsheets is no longer a valuable skill in and of itself. So now what is? What is the judgment to know whether it's good or it's bad, similar to the calculator, right? A spreadsheet is really a calculator on steroids, right? AI-powered financial tools are spreadsheets on steroids. Now, so think about how much faster it can do almost anything than a MBA student or a new MBA that's starting off at Goldman Sachs can do. But guess what? Like that person, they have no judgment. It has no intent. It's just going to deliver. And if you can't figure out whether that's right or wrong, and you take that and you send it to the client, you put it in a presentation, you don't have a job. Because there is absolutely no skin in the game from the AI. It is a tool. You're the one that's putting yourself at risk when you use it.
I actually find that lack of investment or skin in the game as a real asset when I'm working with an AI, because you can ask it a question where you ask it a question, how can an organization do X? And anybody else would start wringing their hands and saying, but we've never done X, or X is way outside of our field of vision, et cetera. It just comes back with an answer. But you're right, you do have to then apply judgment and say, well, okay, that really is too far afield, or that gives us some new ideas to pursue. But I'm saying that from the standpoint of having however many years, that I'm not going to admit, of professional expertise, of working with things and not as me straight out of school. So back to your point about our skills atrophying in the face of using tools like calculators, how does the average person today build up those judgment skills so that they can be useful out of the gate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think first of all, there is no single answer, but I think there are ingredients of that answer, right? And I think the most important part is that there is a role for traditional education. I talk about in the book the concept of learning 3.0, the idea that basically, thanks to AI, you now have a 24/7 infinitely patient tutor that can explain things and again and again and again until you can learn it. That's amazing because that one-on-one direct instruction is kind of the holy grail as opposed to the factory 20-on-1, 30-on-1 model we all grew up with, right? That is new learning. But guess what? That can't sit on a brittle foundation. So you have to develop the foundation. And how do you do that? And this is where I think traditional education, and again, draw the line someplace differently. To me, certainly, I think it's absolutely primary school. I think it shades into secondary. I think after that, there starts to be question marks about what we're actually learning because we start to learn a lot more facts. Even today with Google and Wikipedia, we still learn facts in high school and in college. And what is really the value of just learning facts, right? I don't think it's that high, and yet we still do it. But earlier on, a lot of that foundational knowledge from education is critical because, as I said, the superpower is being able to recognize that the result that comes back from AI is right or wrong without having to spend the same amount of time that AI spent generating it. Because if it did, then obviously you don't save anything, right? You need to be able to, at a glance, know, like, that just can't be right. How do I know that? I'm not sure, but I've seen so many multiplication problems that I simply know a three-digit number times a three-digit number cannot be shorter than 3 digits. Something is wrong. I don't know what it is, but it's wrong. I need to go dig deeper. And in fact, digging deeper can simply be asking AI, hey, that doesn't look right. And again, back to its obsequious nature, a lot of times it'll be like, oh, you caught me. That was wrong. And of course, it's the most absurd interaction in the world. Like, well, geez, why didn't you tell you that in the first place, as opposed to giving me that erroneous answer? So I think step one is there is a role for foundational education because it becomes the bedrock in which you build your judgment against, right? The other part is deliberately training your judgment, right? And I think this is the dream of what we would call a liberal arts education. Now, I am an MIT engineer. I'm on the board of regents, so I had know a little bit about this, more than a little bit about this, and I have a kind of official capacity. And people who don't know me assume that I'm going to say all that is, liberal arts is bunk, and everyone should learn, hard science and whatever. But it's actually the opposite, because now, thanks to AI, and not necessarily where it is today, but where it's going to go, it's going to be better than almost everybody except the best human experts, right? This is almost by definition of how an LLM works, which we can talk about. It's going to be, on average, better as long as there's enough of a corpus for it to be trained on. And for many topics on the internet, there's more than enough. It's going to be 80% better than most humans, right? But not 20%. Anyway, the ability for AI to be able to do all that is wonderful, but you need to be able to discern what's right or wrong. And now, what does that sound like? That sounds like, again, the classical dream of what a liberal arts education should be: critical thinking, right? Ability to debate, hold your point, and argue your point against other people, right? To all writing, reading, all of these core skill sets that are not about any particular discipline, right? They're not about history, or forget American history or modern American history, right? They're about a general knowledge across humanities and science, right? In ability to reason critically. Well, guess what? That is absolutely what people need in order to be able to function in an environment where so much content, so much work is being done by AI, and humans need to rely on judgment. So that's the second thing. Go back to what was again, the dream, because I appreciate this has not been the implementation in many places, but the dream of a well-rounded liberal arts education that is training you how to think, right? And then I think the third thing is, frankly, humility and experimentation, because nobody knows much of anything. Now, of course, you go and you listen to, well, frankly, other podcasts. You go and you read the press releases coming out of these companies, and everyone sounds like, oh, AGI is around the corner. We're filled with geniuses that really understand everything. Both the humans that create this and the systems themselves are both geniuses, right? Everywhere is like all the right answer. And that is completely wrong. I think, Leslie and Alexa, what's important is that we all need to understand that we are at the very beginning of understanding what it's like to work with AI. We are at the very, very beginning, and we all need humility because no one is really that expert. We're all still kind of fumbling around. And if you go out there thinking, and this includes my book, of course, that shouldn't stop you from buying it, but like my book is designed as a playbook with what should be eternal and kind of principles that will hold, as well as superpowers for how to instantiate those principles. I don't expect all of that to hold forever, right? But it is a playbook. You have to take that and make it your own, as opposed to just following advice and expecting that to work, right? And certainly we all know when it comes to technology, as soon as that next update happens, things change. So what matters is not how you do it today, right, on Opus 4.6, but how you do it in general and how you think. And how are you going to do that? If you get stuck in your mind that you are expert, that I know it all, that I know how to use AI, you're going to fail, right? You need to approach it with a humility and a sense of understanding, like, I don't know that much. You don't know that much. It's okay. We're all still learning together.
I'm glad you mentioned the concept of liberal education and the humanities, because that's something that's been on the back burner and a subject of a lot of debate amongst educational, I guess, boards and others as to the value of it in the real job market. But let me go back. One of my favorite books that I keep mentioning this, and Leslie's probably sick of me saying this all the time, but is Carl Sagan's Science as a Candle in the Dark, the Demon-Haunted World. And in 1990, he talked about the erosion of critical thinking skills amongst the populace, from the young to the old, where we are more prone to believe hyperbole, we're more prone to believe fantastical tales than something that is simpler, yet not as exciting, but is science and fact-based. So when you are saying treat AI as an intern, not an oracle, what you are saying in effect is interrogate it.
Mm-hmm.
And to interrogate it, you need skills, interrogate what? Otherwise, we lose discretion. You know what I mean? We lose discretion over the decisions. And when we lose discretion over decisions, we don't know how they're made. We don't know how to deal with the outcome of those decisions. So interrogation means, for example, finding the logical inconsistencies. Tell us, how would you take that further in a practical example? How would you interrogate AI on a question that you have posed to it?
Yes. So Sagan is in good company saying something like that because what you basically just described is the Socratic method. And Socrates himself was questioning the value of writing because, as opposed to memorization,
famously,
yes,
yep,
writing erodes your ability to really understand things because now you can just write it and read it. So you're
parrot it,
cheating as opposed to
yeah.
memorizing it, fully understanding it.
Wow.
So it's funny how, thousands of years ago, we have the same debate about something different. Now, interrogation, working backwards, back and forth, is why I talk about AI as a team member, why I talk about it as a hybrid team that is both you and machine, or multiple people with multiple machines working together. So the new team, whether that's a team of one or a team of 4 or 5 or 10, or doesn't matter, is a hybrid team where you're working together. And to do that, just like you would with a human colleague, you don't just say, hey, you know what, John, everything you said is great. I'm just going to take that. I'm just going to present that to the CEO. We're good to go. No, come on now. You would never do that with a human colleague, right? And you should definitely not do that with an AI colleague, right? Now, of course, how do you do that? So we've talked about two of the principles that are in my book. So one is treat AI like an intern, not like an oracle. And the other one is keep your judgment at the center. Those are respectively the first and the fourth principle. The answer to your question lies in the third principle, which is aim first and then accelerate. Now, that's a fancy way, or a semi-fancy way, of saying crawl, walk, run. And crawl, walk, run is a paradigm that many engineers and technologists are familiar with. Let me just explain it briefly in case it's not obvious. The idea is, if you're going to be working with an AI system, you don't immediately jump to running. You don't immediately jump to, let's throw this in production and have this affect ticket prices, which I just read someone else did, in production, and then lose our minds when the system just discounted everything for all the sales and we just lost $6 million. Oops. And it's like, well, you know what? Maybe what you should have done is interrogate and been more interactive with it in a systematic fashion where you're working on it in a small, contained way, i.e. crawl, on a problem that you know the answer to already. Not just you can recognize whether it's right or wrong. You actually know the answer. And you're asking AI, hey, can you get the same answers that I got? Now, maybe it's getting better than answers than you. That's really what the goal should be, right? It certainly should be able to get those answers faster, okay? But maybe the answer is better. That's fine. But the idea is, in a crawl phase, when you're interrogating it, the first thing you're doing is you're asking it questions where you literally know the answer. And it's funny you use the word interrogate. And again, I know nothing about criminal justice, but I've seen so many episodes of Law and Order, I feel like I do know a little bit. But they start by asking questions where the answer is obvious to lull you into that sense of complacency, right? And it's just like, oh, this is an obvious question. It's an obvious answer. This isn't that tough. And so I think the same thing is there when you were using AI. Crawl. And then you increase the pace of it, you increase the automation of it, and then you walk. And then you get to a point where you can't possibly control the speed of it. You can't check every result. What you need to create is then metrics in order to measure whether it's right or wrong when you get to the run phase. But again, all of that is encapsulated in the third principle, which is aim first and then accelerate. Because I think, Alexa, the key of what you're saying when we're talking about interrogation is that if you just go really fast, and AI has that, first of all, the hype that the people who create the AI are creating, and when they sell it to you is that, but also the natural tendency of it, because of the obsequiousness, is just to go and just go fast and do answers. And like, hey, listen, if you can do one thing, why not do 100 things really fast? Well, if you just slam on the gas in your car, you wrap your car around a tree, right? And the same thing here. If you're going to learn how to use AI, you do it first slowly where you know the answer. You then get to a faster pace where you don't necessarily know every answer, but you're able to spot check to a point where you're completely metrics driven. And then you can go as fast as you really want it to go, right? And that is that kind of back and forth process, iterative process, integrated process is how you're going to be able to manage AI in a way that is more controlled.
So many organizations try to fix problems by just simply sprinkling AI pixie dust onto the problem, and you warned that this can create faster chaos, which reminds me of the slogan or whatever, the coffee helping people do stupid things faster. But I think it also goes to the point you're making about interrogating the AI and also interrogating the other side. Do you want to do what you have been doing faster, or are there other ways to do it? Is there a different workflow? So how should people look at their workflows before they start throwing AI at it?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and I've made a few blog posts, and this is actually the topic of some of my upcoming keynotes. Is that most human workflows were not designed; they evolved. And even if they were designed, the people that designed them are long since gone by the time in which you yourself are being put into that workflow. And this pretty much applies to almost everything. So what we take as kind of an enshrined process of the process, in most cases, is not even not ideal. In many cases, it's just flat out wrong. And you think about the typical example is the DMV, right? Where it's like, why are we doing this? And it's like, well, we do this because the manual says this is what we do. This is step one. This is step two. This is step three. Well, if all you're doing is doing those same dumb steps faster, okay, you're going to get a little bit better, but you're not going to get a lot better. The real value is unlocking what should be the proper workflow. And AI is really good at figuring this out. Now, someone will point out, well, doesn't that mean you'll lose jobs? And the answer is yes, you will. You absolutely will lose jobs. However, should those jobs have existed in the first place, right? And here's where I talk about human workflow. There are people whose job it is essentially pushing paper. They are human pieces of workflow. They have control gates, they are quality checks, their communication, whatever their purpose may be, right? They, of course, don't think about themselves that way. They think about themselves as a much higher, grander purpose. But when you really boil down to it, many jobs are not different than the DMV clerk that's stamping it and passing to the next person, okay? And unfortunately or fortunately, you're going to see a revolution in those kinds of jobs because AI will simply not do that. It doesn't need to do that, and it won't do that. Now, you can force it to duplicate the same workflow, but then you will be eclipsed in this competitive democratic capitalist market that we have by someone who is not. And I think it's all to the better, right? Because I think those jobs were not really good jobs to begin with. They were placeholder jobs. Again, everyone can go to the office and point to the person that is incompetent, that's usually their manager, okay, or someone in some other department. You're like, does that person have a job? Now, forget about unions and protection, forget about that. Even in a regular sense, it's because there's some piece of the workflow that they've really glommed onto and they're defending to the death why that step is super important. And Mark is the guy that owns step 3. Do not screw with Mark, right? Well, now AI is going to screw with everybody all at once. And so anyone who is in a position of controlling workflows needs to really look carefully about should you even do it at all in the first place. And actually, provocatively, what I've been saying now is that if you are working in an organization that doesn't value your input in this regard, you need to think carefully about moving on. Because what might happen is if that is magnified across your entire organization will cease to exist at some point in time. They will be blown apart by someone who is willing to make those kinds of trades. And you yourself will then lose your job also, right? And so you need to think about really understanding what you do. Now, I understand this is a very big ask, and most people do not want to question themselves. But this goes back to the third part 3 of my answer previously, which is humility and understanding. We are in a reset. We are in a revolutionary change in the way we do thought work. And you cannot rest on your laurels. I have plenty of them. Some of them are behind me right now, right? I can't rest on those. Nobody can, okay? You need to really re-examine what you're good at and try to find something that you're going to stay good at as opposed to just some proximate advantage that you have.
Maybe a case in point. I know a lot of people are concerned about, there aren't going to be any entry-level jobs for people who are graduating from university. But I was reading an article about Shopify, which has sort of doubled down on AI, and they in fact have moved from having something like 70 interns one year to having 1,000 interns last year, because they're pointing the interns at the AI. The AI is doing the work the interns had been asked to do in previous years, namely all the repetitive, boring, dumb stuff. And now the interns are basically being asked to judge the output and make decisions based on what processing has been done, which gives them, certainly a leg up. It accelerates their progress in their field, and it also means that Shopify is looking for people who are enthusiastic and willing to embrace new things and apply the judgment that you were talking about earlier. So I think that really illustrates a bit of how things are already shifting.
100%. I think that it's actually, I don't think that the risk is necessarily going to be people at their beginning of their careers. I think it'll be at the beginning of your career if you're not embracing AI at the beginning of
Right.
your career and understanding that you need to get to the top of that hill, right? Very quickly, because there's going to be intense competition at the entry level, but everyone needs entry level people. I think that's not really going to change. I think the bigger hollowing out you're going to see is in all the middle ranks, right? Because there are a lot of people, there's a lot of organizational theories about managing people and managing all these kinds of things, span of control, all this wonderful stuff that is really all based upon human workflows. And again, I think most of those are going to be rewritten and replaced with AI enhanced workflows or fully AI automated workflows. But having people at the beginning of their career who understand AI. I mean, who would hire someone who doesn't right now, right? It's crazy. You wouldn't, right? Because the only other valuable skill they would have is expertise, and you don't have that at the beginning of your career. So your ability has to be you're really good at using AI and figuring out how to create the output that it needs, right? That you need to come in combination with AI. And now the I don't know, flip side of that is who then keeps their job, right? Because I think that is going to be very interesting. And again, thanks to things like Learning 3.0, thanks to the ability to learn while doing that you can do with AI, thanks to the ability for AI to constantly be your mentor 24/7, people are going to be working on real world problems much, much earlier. So my analogy here is social media, right? So let's say you're looking for entry level people for your marketing company. And when you hire them, what are you asking for? You can say, well, show me your social media, right? Show me your accounts and what have you built? Would you ever hire someone who doesn't have a big bunch of followers, that doesn't create good content? Of course not. You'd be like, what is stopping you from doing that? You don't have to come work for me to go do that. You should have been building your personal brand since you basically got a phone, okay? And if you're not capable of doing that, why would I trust you on a client account? It's absurd, right? So I would wager that zero people are hiring marketing interns who don't have personal brands. None, zero. And I think the same thing is happening now with AI. Would you hire someone to go now and use your AI powered workplace? Okay. But then once you've got that job, you're going to have to be better than all of your peers because there are going to be fewer middle level jobs to compete or, actual full-time jobs and middle level jobs to compete for at those beginning rungs, right? So you're going to have to be better than the competition. And that means, in my opinion, embracing AI and using it more effectively, not just being a subject matter expert. So again, the meta skills of judgment, the meta skill of understanding what is useful, what is not useful, crawl, walk, run, aim first and accelerate, all these different principles, in my mind, are what it's going to take for people to get past the competition at those early stages. Because again, Shopify may be hiring 1,000 interns. They do not have 1,000 jobs.
Right.
Yeah, we talked about how some of these jobs that require, for example, the clerk who has to make sure that the signature box is filled. Now, after that, they have to stamp something and move it forward. Those jobs are going to go to AI. But within a professional's own realm, you've talked about relegating these repetitive, low value cognitive tasks to AI. So what are some examples of these low value tasks? Because that should free you up to be able to do some of the more high value stuff. So what should you relegate to AI now?
Yes, so that's a good question because I think it's different for each domain, obviously. But think about a lot of the cases when you have just a purely human team. So forget about technology at all, right? As you become more senior, you move away from the actual doing. So we go back to, investment bankers working on spreadsheets and presentations. That's what junior people are for, right? Those are what the associates for that are climbing to try to get into the more senior level jobs. And back before you had AI automation to go do those things, you just had a group of people that were competing for your job, right? That the way they did that was they did that grunt work, right? And so this is obviously the most obvious place where you can go and use AI instead. the spreadsheets, the things that are more about the quantity of work. And then you're obviously going to look at judging the quality of the work. Now, the same thing applies, I think, to a lot of broad spaces, including writing, content creation, right? Code, which is text, right? Code is text, code is language, right? So that's why you see this happening in coding at a stratospheric pace, right? A supersonic pace, right? Because people are able to operate on code using LLMs in a fantastic way. And you see that there's already starting to be an exponential loop. The doing in cases where the AI speed up is both really fast and the ability to measure the output is good. You know, use a good mechanism to know the quality of it. Those are the first places you look at in terms of how you can multiply your ability. Now, again, I can't answer this in a generic fashion. I think everyone needs to think about what this means for each profession themselves. But I think a good example here, if we go back to the social media marketing space, is the copywriting and graphic design, right? So again, in a large organization, these are kind of broken apart teams. Traditionally, you had people doing all these different functions. They got very good at one thing, right? And then they worked in concert to be able to put out a quantity of posts on social media or whatever. Now, of course, AI can do all of those things. That doesn't mean you should just blindly use it. It also doesn't mean you use it and all you do is you judge where the answer is. What it means is you re-examine that workflow that may have taken 5 humans, that may have taken 5 hours, and now it might take 5 minutes. But you figure out where the best place for humans to go insert themselves, right? Because AI can give you 10 different versions of the same post in about 10 seconds, right? And it can do the same thing for graphics and other images. And now what you need to do, because you're no longer limited by the quantity, you can now say, okay, I want humans to be able to be more able to judge between all these different types of answers and say, this is really the one that I think is best. Or even better, use AI and history and metrics to be able to help you power that decision for judgment. And then here's the key. Once you figure out if that judgment itself becomes repeatable, you then make that part of the repeatable function. In other words, you're constantly increasing and building the pyramid of what you are automating and making it more advanced and making it more higher level, because that's what you're going to have to do. Because anything that you can do more than once, you should really think about automating with AI in some fashion. Because again, if you don't, someone else will. And more importantly, if it's repeatable, that means it's a roboticized thing. That means it is something that is better done by a machine in general than a human. So that applies even to things that start as judgment that later on become something more solidified. So it's both different for every field and it's a bit of a moving target. But I think and the book talks about this. It's really what are the traits that make something automatable in that fashion. The book, I call it 10x execution. And it's a function of the complexity. It's a function of some of the things we talked about earlier. And then it is constantly increasing. It's constantly building on itself so that you're looking at taking more complex things and making decisions about them. And again, let me just, I know this is a long answer. I think one of the important parts here is known versus unknowns. So another way to look at this answer is that if you are mostly dealing in knowns, okay, then it's automatable. If you're mostly dealing with unknowns, it is not automatable.
Interesting.
So you're running multiple ventures, serving on the board of regents and raising a family with special needs children. So how exactly are you using AI to manage all these high stakes environments simultaneously?
Yeah, so I do talk about this in the book. I think that there's a couple of interesting stories here. So this is a good opportunity to insert the last of the 4 principles, which is make AI flow. And the idea here is that the goal of AI is for it to not really exist as something you think about or have to work with, but really something that goes into the background. This concept of flow is not an idea that I created. I took it from someone else. And famously, the idea of a flow state is something that athletes, musicians, people that are performing at their very best tend to do. You ask LeBron James about, does he think about the mechanics of, no, of course not. He just goes and does it, right? And that is where the best of the best don't spend their time worrying about the micro things or the tools. And that is really where your goal is to be with AI, is to get, beyond into all these different things. And now, of course, I use the word goal. And so when I talk about how I use AI, that is my goal but of course I don't get there. But the point of I use AI for, let's say, optimizing my schedule, who are helping me look farther and faster than I could today, right? So, for example, I'm sure like me, almost everyone listening to this, you're inundated with a bunch of crap in your inbox, right? Now, you can set up filters to get rid of that. Let's say you're using Gmail, you set up a filter looking for keywords and you get rid of some of that stuff, right? The reality of it is, what you really need is something a little bit more judgmental, something that's a little bit better at discerning than simple keywords, because you're going to miss things, right? So just like you look in your spam folder for what might have ended up there, but that's another process that you have to do. What you really want to do is to be able to train an AI model against your inbox to say, hey, you know what? These are the kinds of things you should ignore. These are the kinds of things that you should absolutely pay attention to, and then do some research and then come back to me automatically. And then there's a whole middle ground of things that every time you come up with that, you should ask me what to do so that we can train and get better together, right? And that's something that I've been developing. It's an ongoing process to fight the war against email, right? Because it is just, an inundation. Like I said,
Can't keep up. You just can't keep up.
you just can't keep up, right? And again, if you use simple filters, they're going to be wrong, right? And if you get too, you make them too harsh, then you're going to be checking your spam box anyway. And how useful is that, right? So this is where generative AI really does shine, but you have to work at it. Again, the iterative principle of aim first, then accelerate. And you have to really be able to think about what is useful and what is not useful. I think this is part of the point. Again, in your personal life or in your work life, and this is the whole point of the book, is really that you can reach that performance peak both for your personal life and your professional life. But it isn't obvious. It's in many cases, it's a moving target of where you want to be. And so for me, I use it for that. I use it for my calendar. I use it for thought work in terms of strategic thinking. So there's a lot of different examples, as I said in the book. But what I would stress, for the listeners here, is to push yourself beyond what you think is comfortable in terms of using AI. So one area that a lot of people may not think about using, which I do, is the devil's advocate sounding board idea, right? It is the opposite, again, of how most people use AI or use Google, because you're asking it for an answer. Don't ask it for an answer. Tell it to criticize what you think the answer is, or give me 10 other options, right, as to what I thought, or give me a panel of 10 experts in this domain and tell me what they would think, and have them argue amongst themselves and let me watch so that I can see the back and forth, right? There are a lot of techniques in this manner that will help you make better decisions because it is forcing you to think more carefully. So even if it's completely wrong, it makes something that you may have just automatically been like, this is the answer, to be like, well, you know what? I'm going to think a little more carefully, a little more slowly. And now that I can look and see what AI is doing, or maybe it's criticizing or whatever it is, I'm now slowing down, reevaluating what I'm doing so that I can make a better decision, right? That is something that, not many people do. But once you've listened to this and you hear this, go try it. It's addictive, right? It becomes something that, boy, I wish I could ask a human to do that. And again, some people have mentors to do that. But again, how many times can you call your mentor at 2 o'clock in the morning before they're like, really, Ted, you're going to call me again about the same problem at 2 o'clock in the morning? Like, no, don't do that. But the AI, you know what? You can ask it anytime.
I love the whole idea of the devil's advocate, and posing questions to it and asking it to criticize. Because it's also a safe environment, right? I mean, if it's criticizing you and just nailing you, at least it's between you and the screen, and whoever the big tech is behind it was recording everything, right? And not in front of a whole bunch of people. Are there specific tools that you find are really helpful for you in doing some of these stuff?
So I'm very tool agnostic, and that is kind of what I've been telling people, right? And I think the reason behind that is, even if I were to tell you Claude is better than this, or ChatGPT is better than that, or Gemini is better for this, it's going to change in their next release, right? It's a constant battle. I'm very tool agnostic, and the way the book is written, I think the general way in which I speak to people is, look, you need principles, you need a playbook, you need approaches, okay? Rather than this is how I do it in Claude, or specifically Opus 4.6, right? That's not really, I think, a long-term strategy. Like, it literally can only last days or weeks before they update it, even without necessarily changing the version number, silently behind the scenes, okay? And it will start to give you different answers. Or even because your context window gets really, really large, and now the same query, the same prompt is giving you different results, right? Because it's now building upon all of that history that's in your context window. So, I think that's one of the key things, Alexa, is that you don't really have the same A implies B correlation that you have with so many other tools, right? Because you have state, because you have an
Mhm.
ever shifting behind the scenes what's actually in the model, right? So for those two factors alone, the results become very, very different each time you use it. That's a powerful thing, very much like working with a human, right? And so you have to kind of embrace the ability to go use that. So I tend to be tools agnostic. Now, that's not to say that you don't have tools in things like video or whatever, right? There are specific domains, or maybe if you're using a specific like narrow LLM in medical or whatever, that may be very different, right? But when we're talking about generalized LLMs, we're talking about AI, in quotes. I would not really encourage anyone to get too wed to any tool. I would encourage you to build skills that are tool agnostic.
Well, you've given us pointers to a lot of interesting thoughts to pursue with AI, and we'll look forward to the release of your book. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you both for having me. Really fun.
Thanks a lot, Ted. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this TechSequences podcast. We are Leslie Daigle and Alexa Raad. You can reach us by email, techsequences@techsequences.org. We'd love to hear from you to know what you thought about this episode or ideas for future episodes. TechSequences. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook and subscribe through your favorite podcasting service.